my wife, Pat, and I have been on this journey for a while together, and she's a cradle Episcopalian. I grew up in the Church of Christ, as differentiated from the UCC. So I had a very evangelical upbringing, a really lovely upbringing. But Pat ushered me into the Episcopal fold, and I've been so grateful. I can tell you a little bit about Gladdening Light if you'd like to hear it, about how we came to be. Pat and I went to Italy together as students at Rhodes College in Memphis in 1974. And I had never, of course, at that age, I'd never been to Europe. And I'd always been taught, about being careful to gild the lily, and that icons were dangerous. And of course, when I went to Italy, and I experienced, in particular, Cimabue, Giotto, Duccio, some of the early Renaissance painters, there's so much passion and emotion in their work. And I began to see these works of art as a liminal vehicle for me to experience God in a different way. And so this idea of the aesthetic burst forth in that first experience in Italy. And I went back by myself a few years later, and because I liked Giotto so much, I went to Padua. And in Padua, I don't know, how many of you have been to the Arena Chapel, the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua? So you know what I'm talking about. So this is Giotto's masterpiece, and it's a building about the size of this room in this like really crummy industrial area of Padua. But the Scrovegni family apparently made amends to the Pope because of all their usury violations to build this chapel and commission Giotto to paint the life of Christ from the Annunciation to Pentecost around the panels on the bottom layer, and then the imagined life of the Virgin Mary on the upper level. And at that time, you could stay as long as you like, but I went in, I was backpacking. I kind of said, okay, I'll stay like 10 minutes. And so I walked in the door and I stayed for 5 hours. And I had no idea or concept of time in there. And that particular moment, the Germans like to use the word Sitz im Leben, that moment in time changed my whole life. So I came out of that, and Pat and I got married, and we started to have children. And I noticed this book in a catalog called The Glorious Impossible. And it was frescoes by Giotto from the Arena Scrovegni Chapel in Padua. So I bought it, and this beautiful renderings of, details of the chapel next to the corresponding narrative of, the Annunciation, the Nativity, the Passion, and so forth. So as our kids came of age, we began to share these stories and the art with them at holiday time. At Easter, we talk about the Passion, and at Christmas, of course, the Nativity and all the glories of Christmas. And I was reading this, and I noticed that this narrative is very, very powerful. And it was, it was contemporary. And so I flipped over and it's to the front of the book, and it said, authorship by Madeleine L'Engle. And I had read A Wrinkle in Time when I was 12, and it was another seminal moment for me, because if any of you know the climax of A Wrinkle in Time, it's all about love being the binding fabric in the universe. And as dark as things were at the end of that book, love in an instant, this infinite love of God transformed the entire planet and universe. So that, as somebody who grew up under substitutionary atonement and, heal thyself, that Jesus died for my sins and a lot of that theology, it was a breakthrough. So I was in recovery by that point. I've been in recovery 32 years, I think. And I had my eyes opened to do something with this. So I professionally was doing a lot of, this is so primitive. How many of you remember those multiple projector shows you used to see at World's Fairs and stuff? They'd have like 40 slide projectors, and it was pre-digital. So I used to do those. I used to produce those. So I had this idea of taking Giotto and taking Madeline and then adding a score to this and creating a live presentation of The Glorious Impossible. I found out Madeline worked at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine in New York City. She was author in residence, but basically she was the librarian. So I went to a payphone outside of a Wendy's on the highway, and I had all these quarters in my pocket, and I started pumping the payphone, and I called the cathedral, and I said, could I speak to the library, please? And this woman picks up the phone, Madeline Lingle. So I start pitching her over the phone. I said, we've never met, but I have this idea to take your book into a whole nother realm and to score it and have you read excerpts from your narrative. Would you be interested in talking to me? And, it almost makes me cry because people like Jim and Mirabai and Madeline, they're so evolved that they're prone to say yes. They're prone to say yes. When you throw something at them, they're affirming and they say yes. And Madeline said, yes, you must come to New York and meet with me. And it's a long way from start to finish, but she had some people that she knew in Florida. We were living in Winter Park, which is in the Orlando area, and she had some people in Florida come to visit me. And I took them out to my car and put cassettes in and said, now this is the music for the Nativity. And this is when, the Garden of Gethsemane, and this is the music for On the Cross. And so they got back to Madeline and said, this guy's onto something. So I worked with her long distance for many months, and I put together the score. It had everything from David Crosby to the group Oregon, if any of you know Oregon, to Handel, to choral music, to wails, the humpback wails. That's the music we had on the cross, is the sound of humpback whales, groaning in the ocean. And I put all this together, and I did it once with somebody else at our church, and it's an hour-long thing. But she said, come up to see me at Holy Cross Monastery up on the Hudson in upstate New York. And she said, I'm doing a writer's retreat up there. And I said, okay, I'm going to bring all my gear. And I had the script and everything. And I said, Madeline, when I squeeze your arm, I want you to stop talking. And then when I let go, I want you to continue. So I had her right there. And we showed all these frescoes and these details of these frescoes that were just so luscious. And we heard this music and we listened to Madeline read. And all of these people had no idea that we're on the retreat, what we were going to present. And when it was over, Madeline turned around, jumped to her feet, and threw her arms around me and said, "We must do this all over the world." And we did. So for the next many years, we traveled all throughout North America, Canada, Vancouver, California, New York City, and we would present this, and it was truly glorious. So that was really the jumping off point for Gladdening Light, and it opened a window to me to use the aesthetic as a means to enliven our conversation with God. And so I know we're a niche thing, we're not curing cancer here, but this idea of witnessing the best that art has to offer us, whether it's music like Gustavo offers, or poetry, literature, sculpture, painting. We have centered all of our symposia on the arts and brought theologians into the mix to comment on the art and the artists to comment on their work. And I call it a spiritual gumbo, that we kind of put it all together and we really don't know what the outcome's going to be until it's over. And it's usually much more than the sum of its parts. I mentioned last night about the Phosiliron, and that's the origin of the name of Gladdening Light. I thought I would share a little bit about the Phosiliron as the first Christian hymn. For those of us who are Anglican and Catholic, it's in our hymnal, and it is a prayer and a song, a canticle that's offered at dusk. So as you light the candles in your home, you pray to Jesus, "Please come into our home and protect us this night." And the light is illumined to signify this is a holy place and we're going to be safe until morning. So it's a beautiful expression of Gladdening Light, and I thought I would just kind of share that with you this morning. All right. We're going to go until about 10:15 or so, and then we'll break. And, of course, we'll have lunch here again. And if you'll give us a little patience in getting that set up, let me welcome again James Finley.